Imagine this, a tiny, almost ridiculous car, with only 13 horsepower, a single front door, and enough space for only 2 people. It seemed like a joke. And yet, this little machine not only sold, but saved an entire company from bankruptcy. Not just any company, but BMW. So, how did something so small become the reason BMW still exists today? That car was the BMW Isetta, and if you were alive in the mid-1950s in West Germany, Britain, or anywhere across post-war Europe, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. You may have seen one puttering past on a rain-soaked high street. You may have owned one. You may have laughed at one. But here's the truth: that little bubble car played a role in automotive history that most people have never fully understood. To appreciate what the Isetta really meant, you have to understand the world it was born into. Germany, in 1955, was a country still rebuilding. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was underway, but it was far from complete. Working men could buy motorcycles. A full-sized automobile was still a luxury beyond the reach of most families. BMW itself was caught in a painful trap, selling expensive luxury sedans on one end and motorcycles on the other, with nothing in between. Something had to change, or the company was finished. What followed was one of the most unlikely survival stories in the history of the automobile. And it begins not in Munich, but in Milan. Section 1, the Little Isso, where it all began. The Isetta did not start life as a BMW. That surprises some people. But the men who know their automotive history already understand this. The car was conceived in the early 1950s by an Italian industrialist named Renzo Rivolta, owner of Isso Spa, a Milan company that made refrigerators, motor scooters, and small 3-wheeled utility trucks. Rivolta was a practical man. He reasoned that post-war Europe needed an affordable vehicle, something small, economical, and easy to maintain, that would give the working man more than a motorcycle could offer. His engineers Ermenegildo Preti and Pierluigi Raggi went to work on a design that was unlike anything the motoring world had seen. The result was a 4-wheeled, egg-shaped microcar with a single front opening door. The entire front end of the vehicle swung outward on its hinges, carrying the steering wheel and instrument cluster with it, so the driver could simply step in as if entering a very intimate telephone booth. The windows were rounded bubble shapes. The roof had a sliding canvas panel. In the event that the car was involved in a collision and the door could not be opened, the driver and passenger were meant to escape through that sunroof. When Rivolta unveiled the Isetta to the motoring press in Turin in November of 1953, it caused a sensation. Here was a car that measured only 7.5 feet in length and 4.5 feet in width, powered by a 2-stroke, 236 cubic centimeter twin-cylinder scooter engine. It was unconventional to the point of being radical, and it sold. The Italian-built Isetta went into production, and around 1,000 examples were built before Rivolta made a decision that would change the course of automotive history. He wanted to build proper sports cars. The Isetta, he felt, was a distraction. So he began licensing the design to manufacturers in other countries: France, Spain, Brazil, and most significantly, Germany. In mid-1954, BMW came calling. And the deal they struck was not merely a license to build. BMW purchased the complete body tooling outright. The Isetta was now a Bavarian problem to solve. Section 2. BMW's desperate gamble. To understand why BMW wanted the Isetta so badly, you have to understand just how precarious their position was in 1954. After the Second World War, BMW's factories had been heavily bombed, and the company's West German facilities were initially banned from producing motor vehicles. They survived making pots, pans, and bicycles. Motorcycle production restarted in 1948, and in 1952, BMW returned to the car business with the 501 luxury saloon, a handsome machine that the German press nicknamed the Barockengel, the Baroque Angel. The problem was the gap. On one side, BMW had expensive luxury cars that cost around 15,000 Deutsche Marks, beautiful machines that very few people could afford. On the other side, they had motorcycles. In between was nothing, and the market in between was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of German working families wanted something more than a motorcycle, something with a roof over their heads and room for 2 people, but they could not stretch to a full-sized automobile. At the same time, another problem was emerging from the glamorous end of BMW's lineup. The company had invested heavily in the stunning BMW 507 Roadster, a 2-seat open sports car that attracted famous admirers, including Elvis Presley. But at a price that put it out of reach of almost everyone. Only around 250 examples were ever built, before production stopped in 1959. The 507 was draining money that BMW did not have. So when the opportunity to license the Isetta design appeared, BMW's management took it seriously. They did not simply stamp BMW badges onto the Italian design. They went back to basics and re-engineered much of the car. They threw out the 2-stroke ISO engine entirely and replaced it with a 4-stroke, 2 to 147 cubic centimeter, single-cylinder engine derived from their own BMW R25/3 motorcycle, a decision that gave the new car both more refinement and a mechanical reliability that the original Italian unit could not always match. The front suspension was redesigned. So much was changed, in fact, that no part from a BMW Isetta was interchangeable with the original Italian ISO Isetta. In April of 1955, the first BMW Isetta rolled off the production line in Munich. The company called it a Motocoupe. Germany called it the Knutschkugel, the cuddle ball. And they bought it. Section 3, Inside the Bubble. What BMW built. Let us talk about what the BMW Isetta actually was as a piece of engineering, and as an experience, because the men who drove one will tell you it was unlike anything else on the road. The initial production version, known as the Isetta 250, used that 2 to 147 cubic centimeter single-cylinder, 4-stroke engine, which produced 12 metric horsepower at 5,800 revolutions per minute. The engine sat behind the passenger compartment, above the rear wheels. Power went through a 4-speed manual gearbox. The rear track was so narrow the 2 rear wheels were placed only 20 inches apart that no differential was needed. That narrow rear axle also meant that in some countries, the Isetta legally qualified as a 3-wheeled vehicle, which gave buyers significant tax advantages. The car weighed 770 pounds. It measured 90 inches in length and 54 inches in width. Top speed was approximately 53 miles per hour. And fuel consumption was around 50 miles per gallon, at 50 miles per hour. A figure that made a great deal of sense to a Europe, still dealing with fuel shortages and climbing petrol prices. Climbing inside involved swinging open that entire front end, sitting down on the bench seat, and pulling the assembly closed behind you. The steering wheel folded up and to the side as the door swung open, then locked back into position once you were settled. The gear lever was to the left. The pedals were small and closely spaced. There was a gravity-fed fuel system, no fuel pump, with a small reserve tank you accessed by turning a valve behind the seat. When the engine sputtered, you turned the lever to reserve and kept moving. It was not a car for tall men or for men who forgot to buy petrol, but it was honest, economical, and for thousands of families across Germany and beyond, it was their first automobile. That meant something. Section 4, the Isetta 300, refinement in a small package. In October of 1956, BMW introduced the Isetta 300, and this is the model most people remember, and rightly so. The engineers bored the single cylinder out to a 72mm bore and lengthened the stroke to 73 millimeters, giving a displacement of exactly 298 cubic centimeters. Compression was raised from 6.8 to 7 to 1. The result was 13 horsepower at 5,200 revolutions per minute, with noticeably improved torque, 18.4 Newton-meters, at 4,600 revolutions per minute. On paper, the difference between 12 and 13 horsepower sounds trivial. On a 770-pound car, it was not. Drivers noticed the improvement, particularly on hills and in traffic. The flexibility gained at lower revs made the car more manageable in the start and stop conditions of city driving, which was exactly where the Isetta spent most of its life. Maximum speed remained at 85 kilometers per hour, approximately 53 miles per hour, but the journey there was considerably more relaxed. The 300 also brought another improvement. The deluxe version replaced the original bubble-shaped side windows with longer sliding windows, giving the cabin more of a conventional feel. The earlier bubble windows had a certain charm, but they could make occupants feel uncomfortably conspicuous. The sliding windows were a practical improvement that the market appreciated. There was also a practical reason for the engine enlargement that had nothing to do with performance. In certain markets, the 250 cubic centimeter Isetta could be driven on a motorcycle license. When those licensing thresholds changed, BMW needed an engine above that limit to ensure buyers in those markets would qualify under the correct licensing class. The 300 solved that problem neatly. By 1957, the Isetta had become BMW's biggest seller by volume. In that year alone, more than 22,000 examples came off the line, the highest annual production figure the Isetta would ever achieve. The little bubble car was carrying the weight of the entire company. Section 5. A world in a bubble. The Isetta, across nations. The Isetta's reach extended well beyond the Munich factory gates, and that is a part of the story that often gets overlooked. Under license from BMW and from the original ISO agreements, the Isetta was assembled or built in a remarkable number of countries, each adapting the design to local conditions and regulations. In Great Britain, production began in 1957 at a former railway works in Brighton, under the name Isetta of Great Britain. The British cars were built in right-hand drive configuration, which required moving the steering column to the right, but since the engine was already on the rear right side of the car, driver and engine were now on the same side. Engineers compensated by bolting a 60-pound counterweight to the left side of the car. Lucas Electrics replaced the German Hella and Bosch components, and Dunlop tires were fitted as standard. The British factory had no road access. Finished cars were shipped out by rail, the same way the components arrived. In Argentina, the Metalmecánica company in Buenos Aires began assembling a licensed version in 1959, eventually building 798 Isetta-based examples before switching to the BMW 600. In Brazil, Industrias, Romy began building their version in 1955. Even on the competition circuit, the Isetta made an improbable appearance. According to records of the Mille Miglia, the legendary Italian road race, Isetta-based cars competed in both the 1954 and 1955 editions of the event. The image of a bubble car threading its way through the same mountain passes as Ferrari and Maserati is difficult to forget. By the time production ended, BMW itself had built 161,728 Isettas. An additional 41,000 examples had been built under license in other countries. The total global production of Isetta variants across all manufacturers and all nations ran to well over 200,000 vehicles. Section 6. The December 1959 meeting that nearly ended BMW. Here is where the story becomes something larger than automotive history. Because even with the Isetta generating steady volume, BMW was still in serious financial trouble as the decade drew to a close. The luxury cars, the 501, the 502, the beautiful but commercially disastrous 507 Roadster, were consuming resources without generating sufficient profit. The profit margins on the Isetta were slim, the company was carrying significant debt, and, in the corridors of power in Munich, the conversation had shifted from growth to survival. On December 9, 1959, BMW's annual general meeting became a pivotal moment in the company's existence. Hans Fieth, chairman of the supervisory board and a representative of Deutsche Bank, which was among BMW's principal creditors, stood before the shareholders and presented what amounted to an ultimatum. The choices were stark: declare bankruptcy or accept a takeover bid from Daimler-Benz. Under the Daimler proposal, BMW would effectively cease to exist as an independent car maker and would be converted into a supplier of car bodies for Mercedes-Benz vehicles. The vote came within striking distance of approval. A group of shareholders managed to adjourn the meeting before the final decision could be recorded. Among those who intervened was a German industrialist named Herbert Quandt, who at that point held approximately 30% of BMW's shares. Quandt had initially been sympathetic to the Daimler proposal, but he listened to the trade union representatives. He spoke with the workforce. And then, against the explicit advice of his bankers, he began quietly purchasing additional BMW shares until he held 50% of the company. It was an act of enormous financial courage, or recklessness, depending on your perspective. Quandt had staked much of his personal fortune on a company that the financial establishment had written off. What he saw, what his bankers apparently could not, was that BMW had the engineering talent, the brand identity, and the workforce to build something genuinely competitive if given the right product. The BMW 700, a small conventional saloon that had entered production in August of 1959, was already showing promise. New models were being drawn on the boards. The Neue Klasse, the new class, was coming. Herbert Quandt was proved right. Within a few years, the BMW 1500 arrived, and with it came the rebirth of a company that we now regard as one of the world's great automotive manufacturers. The Quandt family retained significant control of BMW for generations. Herbert Quandt died on the 2nd of June, 1982. But none of that future would have been possible without the revenue and the production experience generated by the little Isetta during those crucial years of 1955 through 1962. The bubble car bought BMW the time it needed. Section 7, Legacy, Values, and Where They Are Today. Production of the BMW Isetta ended in May of 1962, 3 years after BMW had launched the conventionally styled BMW 700, that was already pointing the company in a new direction. The Isetta had served its purpose. The era of the bubble car was over, not because the cars had failed, but because the world had moved on. Consumers in the early 1960s wanted something that looked like a proper car, and the German economy had grown strong enough that they could increasingly afford one. For many years after production ended, BMW made no effort to support Isetta owners with spare parts. The company was, by most accounts, embarrassed by its connection to such an unglamorous machine. That attitude has long since changed. Parts are now manufactured and available through specialist suppliers, and a dedicated community of enthusiasts keeps surviving examples on the road. And the values reflect the affection that collectors have developed for these cars. According to data compiled by Classic.com, the average recorded sale price of a BMW Isetta currently stands at $31,568. The highest recorded sale, a 1957 Isetta 300, sold at auction in January of 2023, reached $84,000. Well-maintained driver quality examples can still be found for considerably less, but the direction of travel is clear. These cars are going up. That is a remarkable journey for a machine that originally cost the equivalent of a modest motorcycle and was designed specifically for people who could not afford anything better. The Isetta was never meant to be a collector's item. It was meant to be transportation for ordinary people in difficult times. The fact that it has become a beloved and increasingly valuable piece of automotive history is a tribute to the honesty of its design and the genuine affection that people who lived through that era feel for what it represented. So there it is. The full story of the BMW Isetta, a car that was conceived in a Milan refrigerator factory, rescued by a Munich engineering team, driven by hundreds of thousands of ordinary men and women across a dozen countries, and quietly credited with keeping one of the world's great automotive brands alive long enough to find its true identity. The next time you see that blue and white roundel on an M3, on a 5 Series, on whatever marvel of engineering BMW produces, next, take a moment to think about a 7.5-foot egg with a door on the front, a motorcycle engine in the back, and 13 horsepower to get the whole thing moving. Because, without it, there might not have been a next BMW at all. Now, here is what I want from you. If you have any personal connection to the Isetta, if you owned one, drove one, rode in one, or remember seeing one on the road when you were young, please share it in the comments below. These cars were real life for real people, and those memories deserve to be recorded. I read every comment, and the best ones always come from men who were actually there. If this video gave you something you didn't already know, or even if it simply reminded you of something you'd have forgotten, please give it a thumbs up. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who care about this history the most. And if you are new here, and you have a passion for the machines that shape the automotive world, subscribe. We go deep on these stories. No filler, no hype, just the history, the engineering, and the truth behind the cars that mattered. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.